Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, swimming upstream, salmon ecology, evolution, and environmental pressure, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Fernando Lessa. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you for being here with us today. Over to you, Fernando.
Okay, thanks so much, Rob, for introducing. And yeah, hope everyone is having a nice day. And going to be talking about salmon and ecology evolution, which is a topic that I'm absolutely fascinated. And I believe if you're in North America somewhere in the west or west coast, is a topic that gets a lot of attention and people are really interested in because salmon is such an amazing fish. So let's start. So as Ross said, I'm a natural history documentarist, I'm a storyteller and biologist, and I'm an expedition leader with NatHab. I've been guiding in the Brazilian wetlands for the jaguars, which is an amazing place, and I highly recommend if you've never had the chance, just go and see, because jaguars are such a beautiful animal, and wetlands is something else. So I'm originally from Brazil, probably you can get by my accent, and I was born in a city called Piracicaba. That's a First Nation name, and in the state of São Paulo. So here you have the Brazilian map, and you have an idea. The red dots here is where I was born, right close to the coast. And I like fish a lot. My whole life I've been diving, swimming with fish, fishing, studying fish, and taking pictures and videos. And fun fact, Piracicaba, the city I was born, as I mentioned, is a name in the Tupi First Nation language. That means where the fish hold. So the city is named after this beautiful river you can see, and there used to be a lot of fish, and that's where my passion comes from. So what is salmon, right? It's such a beautiful fish, and what exactly defines salmon? So they are part of the Ornithorhynchus genus, and they're part of the salmonid family, which involves a lot of different fishes and a huge variety of fishes. So I would say, if you've ever seen a fish like this is salmon, is this some way connected to, like, related to salmon? So we have the adipose fin here. That's a real important mark. So in between the caudal fin and the dorsal fin, you have the small round fin. We call it the adipose fin. So every time you see a fish that has an adipose fin, it's probably part of the salmonid family, and it's in a way related to salmon. And here in North America, we have 6 species of salmon. Sorry, 7, because we have the Pacific salmon, we have 6 species of Pacific salmon and 1 species of Atlantic salmon. And today we're going to be covering the Pacific salmon. And of course, if you attending from a different country, maybe from Asia, we also have the Matsu salmon, which is a species we don't get here in North America. But it's a really interesting fish. And of course, steelhead, which is scientifically, it's considered a type of salmon, but it's a more unknown fish. If you're not really into fishing and etc., you may not have seen one, you may not be very familiar, but we'll be covering that. And of course, other salmonid members of the family, all kinds of trout that we get here. So what's salmon and what's a trout? That's something that, especially when they're juvenile, you see it's kind of hard. They look very much the same before they become adults. So they are very related. So the differentiation between the 2 species started about 7 million years ago, and they really kind of split. And now you have this different fish. So salmon, they are all anadromous, so a big part of their life or some part of their life cycle they spend in the ocean. And trout are mostly freshwater fish. There are a couple species that may go in freshwater, but they're very related. They're different species. They cannot reproduce, so they can mate and reproduce the next generation, but they're very similar. And you can see here, these are Chinook salmon, and you can see the adipose fin with that kind of sign of the salmonid family. And salmon is a keystone fish, so it has an immense ecological importance for the North American ecosystem. So there are over 300 species of animals that rely direct or indirect on salmon. And when I mean rely direct is feed on salmon, or it's related to salmon in some way. And indirect, it could be, for example, something that like imagine there's a bird that comes to the river that predates on the dead salmon, and that predator that predates on that bird. So that's an indirect. And we have over 300 species that rely directly on that. So when salmon come back from the ocean and get into the forest, it brings a lot of nutrients, and those nutrients are spread around the ecosystem. And that's very much the importance of salmon. But we also have to remember that for salmon, for some people, sorry, salmon is more than a food source. So especially the First Nations in North America, salmon is absolutely determinant in their life as a food source, as a cultural thing. Their whole life is marked by the salmon cycle, and when it returns, when it gets out of the ocean. So I think that's something we have to be very mindful when you talk about salmon conservation and preservation, is that for salmon, salmon is life. Here's the map that shows where you can find Pacific salmon in the Pacific Ocean. So it's very spread around. So you see mostly United States, Canada, and Russia. Some areas in even Mexico, and all the way to Japan and Korea as well, including a series of small islands in the Pacific. So it's a species that's very well spread around, and that's very important, to kind of protect the species. So if in some area you're not doing that well, you may find some other area. So that's a really good and a really important thing for us. And you can see they are found in the ocean during their adulthood, and also in the river when they're small before leaving to the ocean, or when they come back to spawn. And here you have the same map that actually shows how many species of salmon you can find in each territory. So you can see that the west coast of the United States, majority of Canada coast, you see it's a very, very important hotspot. So you find 5 to 6 species, different types of salmon, and that makes that area extremely important, because we need that variety, and it means that there's a lot of resources for the salmon to come and live, and also for the ecosystem to rely on that. So those areas that are docked, they are even more important, because you have all the species coming to that same place, and then it kind of makes those areas even more important. So we're going to talk about the Pacific salmon life cycle. So as I mentioned, Pacific salmon is an anadromous fish, which means a part of their life is spent in the ocean. So they are born in fresh water, the eggs hatch, then they become fry, then they swim back to the ocean when they're juveniles or small. In the ocean, they will feed and grow, and when they're ready, they will come back to fresh water to spawn. And for me, that was born in Brazil, finding an anadromous fish was something absolutely unimaginable, because we really don't find many species in South America that have the kind of life cycle. And it's a beautiful cycle, and it's very complex, because the fish has to adapt and survive to such a variety of different situations, right? They're born in fresh water, super cold water, there's no salt, then their body has to adapt it, so they live in the ocean, then they have to adapt back. So it's a fascinating fish. And fun fact, one of the big difference between Pacific salmon and the Atlantic salmon is every Pacific salmon, after they spawn, they will die. And the Atlantic salmon some of them will not die and they can come back and spawn over and over. So that's like a huge differentiation between the two species. So Pacific salmon, they're born in fresh water. The eggs are laid in fresh water. They hatch. Depends on the species. They may spend some time up to 4 years in fresh water. Some species, the eggs hatch and just swim right away. Then they get in the ocean, they will grow, and then when they're adults and ready to spawn, they will come back. And the life cycle between species varies a lot. So pink salmon, which is the smallest salmon, it's around 2 years. So from the eggs hatching to the adults come back is 2 years. And from some other species like Chinook or king salmon, if you're in the US, they can go up to 7 years in some populations. And salmon, as I mentioned, they're absolutely important because they fertilize the environment. So the dead fish, when they die, they will fertilize the river, providing nutrients for those aquatic organisms that will later feed the fry. So if you go like in a winter day, if you're North American, if you go in a winter day and you go and check out the streams, you're gonna see beautiful clear water, and that water is clear because there's very few nutrients. So when the fish come back, lay their eggs, those eggs hatch, there will be absolutely no food for the fish. So you don't see insects. There's very few life that can live in that cold, cool, clear water. So for Pacific salmon is determinant that the adults, when they die, all that organic matter will decompose, and that will feed small insects. So when the eggs hatch later in the winter and early spring, those small insects will be the food for the fry. So that's why, since time immemorial, First Nations always practiced like they would feed on the salmon, and then it will come back and dispose the bones and all the remains of the food in the river. Because if you just go and take all the dead salmon from the river, when the eggs hatch, there will be no food and the cycle is broken. So they're extremely important. And that's interesting because if you imagine the adult salmon coming from the ocean, they go all the way to the middle of the Pacific Ocean and come back to the forest to spawn. So they kind of work as a bridge, bringing nutrients from thousands of kilometers far away deep in the ocean back to the forest, and vice versa. When they leave as juveniles, they're taking all that energy that was inside the forest and bring it back to the ocean. So it's a really interesting way to kind of get the energy going from different ecosystems that otherwise there will be no other way. So when the adults lay their eggs, only 1% of those eggs will hatch. And from the eggs that hatch, 1% will become fry. And from that fry, only 1% will return to spawn. Everything else will die and get back to the food chain and provide nutrients. So here in this picture, you see this is an American deeper, which is a really cool bird. They specialize in dig the salmon egg nests, or redds as we call it, and it just digs and get the eggs and feed on them. So the thing is, salmon mobilize and spread nutrients all over the food chain, if they're in the forest or even in the ocean. So salmon is an amazing species. And here I have a graph that kind of shows. So according to a study from the University of Washington, streamside vegetation gets around 25% of nitrogen from salmon. And some of researchers point that over 70% of the nitrogen found in the trees come from salmon. So imagine when bear go catch a salmon in the creek, it eats and leave the remains in the forest, that will decompose and provide nutrients from the forest. So it's not just animals, it's the whole forest depends on it. And by the way, if you see in the Dose of Nature, we have a really interesting presentation. It's called Fishing in Eating Forest, when they talk exactly about that, how the nutrients goes from the fish to the forest. So really recommend, if you're interested in the topic, to watch it. And here in this graph, you can see, so the red circle is the energy that the salmon takes from the ocean. And the bright green is actually the energy that it releases to the ecosystem. So when I say that salmon makes this bridge, bringing nutrients from an area and depositing in another area, so actually salmon produce more energy to the system than it actually takes it, considering that only 1% of 1% of 1%. So salmon, they are very important. They feed and fertilize the entire ecosystem. So in the West Coast, we have 6 species of Pacific salmon. So first one I'd like to talk about is the pink salmon. This is the most common salmon. They are also the smallest one and the most abundant. Their life cycle is very short, around 2 years, and they don't grow much. So usually 2-3 kilos, around 6 pounds each. And fun fact, these are amazing fish. And especially like here in Canada, people don't know much about them. They see them in the market and they don't buy it. They think they're not good eating. But if you're looking for a renewable resource, like an eco-friendly resource of fish, pink salmon is an amazing species. I highly recommend you switch from other species to pink salmon, because they are by far the most abundant. And so far, they are the species that are doing the best with different climate changes. Is they're very numerous and they're small, they have shorter life cycles. This fish seem to be doing pretty well. Actually, this year, here in the west coast of Canada, we have one of the biggest pink runs in the last 20 years. So in some streams, you had 100,000 fish swimming. So these guys are one of the few salmon that are really doing good now. And their text, when you see a salmon, how you know if it's a pink salmon? They get a big hump on their back when they're spawning. So if you ever go see spawning salmon and you see this fish with a crooked jaw and a big hump, you know these are pink salmon. And also another fun fact, these guys, they don't swim too far most of the time. They tend to spawn closer to the ocean. And when their eggs hatch, they don't spend any time in fresh water. So the eggs hatch and they swim straight back to estuary and then to the ocean. Sockeye salmon, I think that's the Salmon's trademark. So that's the one that everyone always talks about, because this red intense color. They're very interesting fish. Usually they're fine. Usually they require a lake as part of their life cycle. So the adults come back from the ocean, they lay their eggs, the eggs hatch, and those fry will swim to a lake, usually in alpine, very cold water lake. They spend up to 2 years there, and then they swim back to the river, estuary, and back to the ocean. And they're one of their favorite salmon for eating. Everyone loves them. They really are super tasty. But these are one of the pop species that are actually having a hard time with climate change. So something to be mindful when you're choosing what you're going to be eating. I highly recommend maybe give a chance to sockeye salmon and stick to pinks. And we have chum salmon. Some areas you might know as a dog salmon because they have this big teeth. And for me, these are the really interesting fish. A lot of people don't know much about them, but they grow almost the size of the king and the Chinook salmon. And they usually spend very few time, like once the eggs hatch, they spend a couple of days in fresh water, and then they swim back to the ocean and come back as adults. And I would say the distinctive mark when you see spawning fish, they got really big jaws, and you see the males fighting a lot for the for spawning ground. and it's just a beautiful fish. And you see the adults when spawning, they have this red kind of purplish stripes, and they're quite big. They can get up to 10 kilos or 20 pounds. The coho salmon is another species that I think they're just amazing. So these are the guys that spend most time in fresh water. So once the egg hatched, some populations spend up to 2 years, some population even more. So if you ever seen juvenile salmon in a river, it's probably coho. And they're a really interesting fish because they really are agile and they're able to jump really big waterfalls. So a lot of the time you see pictures of the bears eating salmon, they're eating coho. They're able to jump up to 6 meter tall waterfalls, and they have a preference to lay their eggs in small streams and really had water. So they do amazing migration, and sometimes you see coho spawning like really shallow creeks, like it barely covered the fish. So they're really interesting fish, and the distinctive, they're when they're spawning time, they get this red color, not as red as the sockeye. So it's a mix of red and black, and they have this crooked jaw and almost kind of like a funny nose. And they usually late spawner. So other fish will come, and the last salmon to come to spawn is coho. So right now it's winter. If you in one of those areas that you can actually find salmon, if you walk to a stream nearby you, you probably will see coho salmon spawning right now. And Chinook or king salmon, I think that's one of the most popular one. They're by far the largest salmon. They can reach up to 30 kilos or 60 pounders. They're amazing swimmer, huge fish, and they're extremely important in every sense. So for commercial fishing, they are very important for the orca whales. Some population of orca whales, like the resident ones we have here in close to Vancouver, they feed specifically on Chinook salmon. They only look for Chinook salmon because since they do long migration, they are large fish. They have a lot of fat. So this is one of the most important salmon species. And then the steelhead, which is the kind of unknown cousin. Steelhead is also considered a salmon species. Some people may call also them as rainbow trout. So what's the difference between steelhead and a rainbow trout is that rainbow trout will spend their whole life cycle in fresh water, and steelhead is one rainbow trout that one day wake up and say, I'm going to go to the ocean. So like salmon, they go to the ocean, they spend some years there, and they come back to spawn in fresh water. But the cool thing is, like Atlantic salmon, they steelhead don't necessarily die after spawning. So some First Nations would call them ghost salmon, and some will not even feed on them because they realize that the fish will come back and spawn over and over. So they'll say, these are goldfish, they don't die. So steelhead are amazing fish. Science is still studying what makes some of those fish go back to the ocean and some fish stay in fresh water. It's just right now we believe it's just a different strategy for living, just to kind of protect the species. So if the ocean is not doing well, you still got the genius in fresh water, or if the river is not doing well, you still get the genius in fresh water. So probably it's just a survival thing, just make easier for the species to survive. But unfortunately, right now, steelhead is the salmon species that is struggling the most. Some rivers that are known for having 10, 20,000 fish in the spawning season right now are not getting any. So it's a beautiful fish, but unfortunately, they're definitely not doing well. And they are protected in most North America. So I believe we won't find this fish to buy in any fish market. If you're not a fisherman that end up to catching one, it's very rare to see them. And this is a picture that kind of shows the variation. So here on the left, you have the juvenile. So basically, after the eggs hatching, they swim back to the ocean. So you have most salmon, they have this dots we call power marks. And when you see a fish with power marks, that shows that they're still juvenile. So once they get in the ocean and start growing, the salmon, they get this very silvery color, which is a characteristic that you find in fish that swim in open water. So they will migrate out to the open ocean, the open Pacific Ocean, and follow schools of fish, squid, prawns, looking for food. So up to 5 years, depending on the species. And then that's those open water ocean fish. They come back to fresh water. So their body has to adapt to that whole different in salinity, temperature, and everything. So plus they have to adapt their body to reproduction. So they get in fresh water, their system changes totally. They stop feeding, and basically all the energy that's in their body will be used for reproduction. So like their hormones change a lot. You see the difference in colors and body shape and everything. Like the fish changes totally, and it only focuses in spawning. So they don't eat, or their digestive system shrinks, and every drop of fat or energy in the fish will go straight to reproduction. So fun fact, when you see spawning salmon, if you see like a dead one and you cut, you see that the flesh is probably white or rosé, will be very pale color, different from when you get the fish in the ocean that's very bright orange, because all that pigment, it goes in the eggs and it goes to their reproduction. So that's why if you eat a spawning salmon, it's not going to have any taste at all, because there's no fat, there's nothing there. It's basically muscles. The fish really use every drop of energy for swimming, fighting for spawning ground, and lay their eggs, and of course changing their color, so they become beautiful fish. And for me personally, it was very hard to realize, like, oh, is this the same fish that when you see them in the ocean? Because if you see sockeye, it goes from a silver fish to absolutely red fish. Like, how is this possible? But yeah, salmon is a beautiful species. And just to have an idea, salmon's been around for really long time, and you have some fossils of old species. So you have this gigantic salmon, the saber-tooth salmon, which you would reach almost 3 meters. So they're not around anymore, but you can compare it to the size of salmon. So salmon is an amazing fish. But unfortunately, the fish are facing a series of environmental issues that is really affecting their populations, which such a complex life cycle is very hard. So if you don't take care of your rivers, it's hard, salmon can't live. If you don't take care of their ocean, it's impossible for salmon as well. So that adds a different level from complexity in preserving salmon, because you have to preserve all parts of the ecosystem. So what's going on with salmon? What are the causes of salmon decline? What's going on? So salmon decline started when white men start colonizing North America. So back in time, First Nations used to have a very peaceful relation with salmon, and they would fish a lot and feed a lot on salmon, but they would use different methodology that preserve the stocks that we don't nowadays. So the industry here in North America really started in the 1900s. Just to give an idea, 1901 in Vancouver, they harvest 27 million salmon. So that's definitely not a sustainable number to harvest, because you're basically just taking everything that's in the ocean. And nowadays, you see that we are around 10% in some rivers, like in the Columbia, And in some rivers like the Fraser River in Canada, we estimate that nowadays we have only 1% of historical numbers. So overfishing is definitely a huge problem. And here is a really cool study that came out recently. So basically, it was a proof that First Nations been harvesting salmon in a, I'll say, in an eco-friendly way. So they were able to get the fish they need, but it's still without affecting the population. And how do they do it? Like, why don't you do the same? So nowadays, most of the salmon that we eat is catch in the ocean, so far away from the rivers. And First Nations back in time, they would fish exclusively in the ocean. So when the fish go back to freshwater to respawn, they will be these weirs. So basically, fish gets there and they will stay in the water, but they will get trapped. So First Nations, they could come to the weirs and select the fish they want to harvest. And actually, it was proved that they will favor males because a male can spawn with different females, but a female can. So by selecting which fish they would release, and then that fish will be able to keep going upstream and spawn, you could harvest a certain number without affecting the population. Unfortunately, nowadays, we catch them on the ocean. We catch different stocks that may be more threatened than others, and males and females, they all together. So we don't do this differentiation. And of course, we harvest way too much. So that's why First Nation were able to live for thousands of years harvesting salmon, and we are not. So logging, it's also an extremely important problem for salmon. So salmon need forests, salmon need old growth, big forests. You can't have a healthy salmon stream without the forests. And if you don't have a healthy stream, you can't have salmon. So what's the importance? How does forest relate to salmon? So first thing, you need those large trees to provide protection and shade for the fish. So salmon is a cold water fish. When they get in the ocean, when they get in fresh water, they need cool water to survive. And if it's a stream that the sunlight just hit it straight, it can warm up the water and kill the fish. So any temperature above 18 Celsius or 64 Fahrenheit, 100% of the salmon will die. So you need those large trees providing shade for the fish. And also, if you go to salmon stream, you see a lot of dead trees in the water. And that's very important because that provides shelter for adults when they're spawning, and also for the juveniles, because there's a lot of predators, right? Birds and other larger fish, and everything wants the salmon. So those trees are very important. They provide shelter. And the catch is nowadays, back in time, we thought that we could just go and log the forest, and as long as we plant new trees, that forest will grow back and everything will be good again. But the problem is that young forests consume a lot of water. So if you get a salmon stream, you log the trees around and then you plant new trees. Those new trees, for a really long time, they require a lot of water that should be in the stream to grow. So basically, until the forest grows again, it will take water from the stream, will not be able to provide the shelter and shade the water. So unfortunately, when you talk about salmon, you just cannot log salmon watersheds. But we do it. And pollution, of course, is a big issue for all sorts of fish, but salmon specifically. So recently it came out this research that find out there is one compound used in car tires that is extremely toxic for fish. So this is still new information. It's been around in the media in the last year, but as science gets deeper in the problem, they find out that component is a specific toxic for coho salmon, which is a stock that's not doing well. So when you have tires in the water, they release this component, and that kills 100% of coho salmon. 2 weeks ago here in Vancouver, we have an urban stream that gets a nice coho population, and we have a big rain, so that rain kind of washed all the sediment on the roads, and that ends up in the river, and that killed every single coho salmon that was in the water, adults or juvenile. So pollution is a huge problem, and we really have to, if you want to have healthy salmon populations, you're going to have to address pollution in general, but specifically this component that's used in the car tires, because basically they are one of the main components they use to harden the rubber. So, and you can't have salmon. And of course, you still find, we drive around our salmon streams, so there's no way you can have a car with a tire close to urban stream, because they will release this component in the water and we end up killing salmon. Another interesting fact that we don't really think about, so is salt, which is a huge issue for salmon. So usually salmon comes in the fall and they will stay in the river for a couple weeks. They will lay their eggs right at the beginning of the winter, and then those eggs will be dipped in the ground, in the gravel, for up to 3 months, and then they hatch. So those eggs, they will stay in the gravel during the winter, which is the coldest month, and that's where we use salt a lot. So when you salt the roads and then comes rain or the snow melts, that salt ends up in the river, and that's extremely toxic for the fish eggs. So that's another issue that we have to sort it, which is if like more than 12.5% salt gets in contact with the eggs or the elements, they all die. So we really have to find a solution, maybe some other thing that works salt, but not that toxic for fish. And hatcheries, which is something that most people are not aware, there used to be another alternative to supplement low returning fish numbers. So, back in times, there's no fish coming, let's just create more fish, release, and they will come back. And it doesn't work very much like that. So nowadays, there's a shift towards conservation. So back in time, there was an idea that you need to release more fish. We don't have enough fish. So especially the Canadian government subsidized a lot of hatchery production. So you're just dumping a lot of fish. But thankfully, nowadays, they realize that it's not just a matter of fish, you need the environment. So now the government now is more investing in restoring the ecosystem, making the river more fish friendly. So when those fish come back, they are able to respawn, and life cycle just keeps going more than just release fish. And of course, hatchery, they hear the fish in captivity, and they have some profound effects on the physiology of salmon. So the hatchery fish, they behave different, they have a morphology different, they have different migration patterns, and they have a different survival. So actually, since they are released larger size, they are more able to survive than wild salmon. But you have to remember that hatchery fish are a man-selected fish. We choose the male and we choose the female that we think fits better. But actually, what we really want is natural selection. Nature is selecting what's the best male and what's the best female, and those and reproducing those. So unfortunately, the fish produced by hatchery are not as strong as the wild fish. But hatcheries can still be an important tool, right? If you are talking a population that is already extinct and have no fish, you have to start some way. So hatcheries could be an alternative. If you're looking for a stock that you want to provide fish to be fished, hatcheries could be an alternative as well. And also, I believe hatcheries are a very important education tool. So I'm not saying we can't have hatcheries. I'm just saying that we have to be very mindful how hatcheries are used. Having hatcheries as fish factories is definitely impacting salmon. And of course, climate change, I think that's something that's affecting everyone, and is definitely affecting salmon in everywhere, either in freshwater, either in the ocean. This has really big impacts on salmon. So here's an illustration that kind of shows how climate change is affecting salmon. So if the temperature is not okay in the ocean, that will affect the pH, that will affect the zooplankton, that will affect the small fish that will feed the salmon. So fish can, like salmon, can have a good survival life. So if they're in the ocean and if they're in the river and the temperatures are going crazy, like, you know, it's too hot, should be cooler, salmon can survive in cool water. And also it totally affects the species interaction. So for example, salmon are used to migrate some areas in the ocean looking for squid. If the temperature is not adequate, the squid is not going to be there. So the fish spends all their energy to catch those spots and get there. There's no food, so they're doomed. So climate change affects salmon in different levels and in different situations through over their life cycle. But can salmon keep pace with climate change? Like, what's going to happen? Are they going to go extinct? So that's the question that I ask myself all the time. And I think no. I think there's hope. I think salmon is an amazing species, super resilient, and I really see there is if you give them a chance, there's future. If you give them a chance, you know, they will stay. So they're known for being a resilient species, right? Some salmon migrate 1,700 kilometers in the ocean and in fresh water. You know, these are very, very strong fish. And they've been around for a really long time. You know, you can find like salmon fossils from almost like 15 million years old. But what's really cool is that the number, like if you see the actual salmon population, they are descendant of very few fish, which means as long as there are few fish, that population was like, back in time, it was able to rebound. So I think that's an important indicator that means like these are strong fish. If you give them a chance, they will rebound. So sometimes you see some populations that were almost wiped out, and then you start taking care of the river, you start not fishing that population, and it rebounds. A good example is the pink salmon run that we have this year. So these are very strong fish. We just got to give them a chance. And it's really cool because their evolution is linked to tectonic shift. So you see salmon speciation, so they create like the diversion of different species. It's really related to how the tectonic plate shift. So some populations got isolated during those phase shifts, and that's how salmon was created. So, you know, if this is a fish were able to deal with tectonic shifts and eruptions and everything, I'm sure they are able to deal with climate change. And how are they going to do that? How are they going to adapt? So, as I mentioned, they were able back in time to adapt to some absolutely crazy environmental challenges, and that's the key for its future. And something to consider is we have a lot of ice still in the northern hemisphere. So when you talk about the temperatures going up, of course, it will affect the whole salmon cycle, but it's also melting some ice, and that would probably create some new environment for salmon. So we already got some studies going on when basically scientists are going to this glaciers and ice fields up north and start seeing some rivers that are like 30 years ago were absolutely covered in ice. Now that ice is melting and salmon is coming to colonize those streams because there's no ice anymore there. So it's a viable ecosystem. So, you know, salmon is not a species that's just staying around waiting, right? They really fight for their survival. So, you know, there's, again, if we give them a chance, they will be able to rebound. And for me, as a scientist and a salmon lover, when I read the first time this research on melting glacier and salmon colonizing new ecosystems, that for me was like, whoa, you know, there is a chance. So I would like to show two populations that for me are amazing, and they're really a sign of salmon resilience and ability to deal with the challenge that we pose in them. And interesting fact, these are two populations that you're going to be seeing. They were never photographed before. These images you see now are the first time they've been shown. There's no research, no pictures whatsoever. These are very, very rare fish, and they're part of some projects that I'm involved in. So this is the Wigeon Slough sockeye. So it's a very small population. We're talking less than 1,000 fish. And you see a slough is a tidal area, so it has influence from the tide, and you see all this grass. It's definitely not a place you would expect to find salmon, especially sockeye. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, sockeye needs an alpine stream, sorry, an alpine lake for their juveniles to hear and etc. And here we don't have that. It's it's mud, sand, and grass. And there's a population that really adapt to this ecosystem. So just to give an idea where Wigeon Slough is, so here's on the left, you have a map of Vancouver area, and here in the red dot, you have Wigeon Creek. So, and this population is so close to Vancouver, you're talking like less than 100 kilometers, and until 20 years ago, people have no clue they exist, right? Today, if you type on Google Wigeon Slough sockeye, you're not going to find much. There's no research. They're so unique, and it was so imaginable. It's unexpected to find someone living in that area that people didn't even bother looking for until someday someone said, "Oh, look at this fish." Very rare, guys. So this fish evolved to use this area. So regular sockeye, they come from the ocean, they get in an alpine stream, they swim high up, lay their eggs, and then the fry will live in the lake and then swimming back. But these guys here, they adapt absolutely different. So they come from the ocean, they get into this area, they lay their eggs, and once their eggs hatch, those fish swim straight out to the ocean. So they don't hear in fresh water, which is something that all sockeye species do. They just go right away. And also, sockeye are kind of big fish, but this area is so shallow and it has the tide going up and down. So this fish evolved. They changed their size, and you don't see any trees here to protect those fish. So imagine if you have a school of redfish swimming in shallow water, they wouldn't last much, right? Bears and eagles will just come and hammer them. So they change their color as well. They change their size, they change their color, they change their whole life cycle is adapt. And you can see here, usually sockeye are like bright red, and this guy are bright or pale yellow. You just have a small hint of red, and they're half of the size of the fish, right? So a sockeye gets like, I don't know, around 10 pounds, and this guy barely reached 6 pounds. So I think it's a really cool example that shows if fish has the minimum requirements, they will adapt. That doesn't mean that every species or population we will adapt, but it means that there is the possibility. So these fish change their color, their life cycle, their size, and their survival, basically, to live in this unique area. And I was really hoping that I could bring an underwater shot of this fish for you guys, but I spent 10 days in the field this year trying to find one. And as I mentioned, these are very, very rare fish. And unfortunately, this year we didn't see any return. So I just hope we miss it and they came and spawn, and we try again next year. But again, these are very threatened fish. But we have some even more extreme examples of salmon resilience. So these are the mini humps. So again, this is the first picture of this population. And these fish are only found in one single lake in the Broughton Archipelago in the north west coast of Vancouver Island. So the easiest way to get there from Vancouver, you take a ferry to the island, then you go all the way to North Island, then you take another 3-hour boat, and you get to Gibson's Island, and sorry, Guilford Island. And Guilford Island, you drive 3 hours in the logging road, then you hike 2 hours in the bush, and you get to this unique lake that's only 7 meters long, and that's the only place that this fish are found. And this lake is really interesting because it's an island, right? So it's not close to the ocean, and it's a very, very deep lake. It's 7 meters deep. But from those 70 meters, 40 of those 70 are below sea level. And we don't even know if it has any connection with the ocean. You know, nobody ever studied that. And so this fish, they spend their life in this lake. They don't swim back to the ocean. They are landlocked sockeye. And when it's during the spawning time, they swim up to this small stream that's like 200 meters long. It has very tannic water, very small flow. So absolutely not what you expect in a salmon stream. But they do live there and they adapt. So it's interesting because this population, they study on it is just starting. So right now, science believe that this used to be a sockeye population that will come in the ocean, the fish will swim the stream, get to this lake, spawn, and then the fry will swim back to the ocean. But back in time, we logged this area intensively. It would be the dam, so the fish could not, when they come from the ocean, they could not go back, so they become landlocked. So we absolutely altered their environment in such a way that fish basically could not survive there, but they thrive. They find a way to overcome that. So this is just images of the lake, so you can see all this amount of logs. So even nowadays that the dam is not there, fish simply cannot reach the lake. And these are some more images. So these are very small guys. They're like 20, 15 centimeters, which is, you know, the size of a juvenile salmon, that something you would never find. You see it has the paw marks, which I mentioned earlier in the presentation, that shows these are juvenile fish, but these are not. These are spawning, but they just kept this juvenile characteristics. And they live in a very deep lake, so of course water can penetrate. Light can penetrate 7 meters deep, so it's a dark lake. So if this fish lives deep in the lake, there's no light there. So there's no light, there's no color. So this fish lost all their coloration. So they're black. You can see this male here. They're absolutely black or kind of very dark, which is something you would not find expecting in salmon population. So they change it quite a lot. So they shrink in their size, they change their coloration, they kept some signs of juvenile marks. So absolutely changed their whole ecology just to live in this ecosystem. And this is a new thing, it's not accepted by science yet, it's still under study. There is a belief that this salmon may be able to spawn over and over. So this would be the first sockeye population that they release their eggs and they don't die. They come in and spawn again. And this belief is based on the fact that we did a lot of surveys. Like there's people doing spawning surveys every year, and they see the spawners around a couple thousand fish spawning every year, but you don't find any dead one. So there's a belief that there may be no spawning mortality, which would be something absolutely new for salmon. And these are likely the first salmon population that evolved due anthropogenic activity. So we cut the forest, we dam the lake, and salmon react and find a way to survive. So, you know, the anthropogenic activity was not enough to extinct this population. So for me, this is a good sign that shows, these fish are tough. They're a hard nut. They're not going to go easily. They will fight back. So if we give them a chance, salmon is able to adapt. And this is just an example. So you can see here on the left side, these are sockeye, and on the right you have mini humps, and they are absolutely different, but they still the same fish. So again, they're here to stay, and as long as we give them a chance, we have to do our part in the story. Fish will come back, they will stay. But if we keep the pace we are now, logging the forest, releasing hatchery fish, overfishing, and not taking care of the issues by climate change, we're not like slowing down climate change, then it will be hard. And thank you so much. So this is what I have for you today, and hope we have some questions.
All right, thank you, Fernando. Now, before we start in with the question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. Okay, let's get to some of these questions while we have time. So, are there protections anywhere for salmon so that they're not overfished? Laws or amounts, limit on amounts or size restrictions, anything like that?
Yes, there are. Actually, there are very strict restrictions for salmon. But the problem is, since they're really long distance migratory fish, some fish they spawn in Canada, they swim all the way to Russia or Alaska, and in that area, in those areas, the rules or it's just different. So right now, the biggest issue is not just how much we harvest, but how we harvest. So there are some recent studies that came out that that we had like recently an immense abundance of sockeye salmon in Alaska, but they find out that a lot of that abundance, a lot of those sockeye were actually Canadian salmon. And those fish were being catched in Alaska, which is kind of it makes very tricky. And also it's the same here. We target in Canada a lot of Chinook salmon. They're actually going to the Columbia River, but they're here. So because of this long migratory journey that the fish do, it creates a huge issue for the stocks conservation. And also science is not we not got a consensus on exactly where their migration routes exactly are and where each population goes. So that makes harder. So for example, some rivers some populations are doing better than others, and those populations could be harvested as long as you protect the others. But since we don't know exactly where each one go, it makes harder to say, okay, let's not fish here, let's fish there. So there are very strict legislation, but it's very hard to, not even to enforce, to know what you're catching. So that's the big challenge.
So one of our guests mentioned that Scotland is known for salmon. Do you know if the Scottish species migrate to salt water? Is that something that happens?
Yes. So in Scotland, you get Atlantic salmon. So they are anadromous fish as well. They migrate from freshwater to the ocean and back the same way as Pacific salmon. The only difference is that the Atlantic salmon don't die. So then in a sense that makes easier, because if you say, okay, I'm not gonna catch the adults, they might come back, something that don't happen here. But yeah, they spend a bigger part of their life in the ocean as our salmon here in the Pacific.
So if salmon always head back to the place where they were spawned, how is it that they are colonizing new rivers? What makes them do that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So salmon, they will come back. They always come back to the same river that they were born. But there are some species that, like to get lost a little bit. So it's not uncommon to find, a couple of fish of that population just get it wrong. They end up in a different river. So that's not a scientific number, but let's say 1% of those fish just get lost. Instead of turning right, they're turning left, and they end up in the wrong river. So that's how they are able to colonize some new areas. And so, for example, chum and sockeye are two species that are known to have some stray fish. Basically, they get to a river close by, or they go to a different rivers, and it's not uncommon. For example, here in Vancouver, if you go in November, like in the river I have close to my place, you're gonna see a lot of coho. But then you go back in December, the fish are not there anymore. So it's common that they get in the wrong river and then they swim back to the ocean, and then they go back to another river. So, salmon like to explore. So again, it's absolutely true. They always come back to the same river, but some fish may get lost, and in that way, they end up colonizing new areas. And of course, if the salmon gets back to a river and there's no conditions for it to spawn, it will not come back there anymore, right? So they will look for more friendly places to spawn.
So, what kind of salmon are raised in the farms? Are there some species that are more able to be farmed than others?
Yeah, so nowadays we farm mostly Atlantic salmon in the west coast of Canada and the US. And that choice was made because since those fish are farmed in a very high density, if you have that high density with the native fish, they would just not be able to control the number of diseases. I didn't put that in the presentation. Salmon farms are a huge issue for salmon survival. So like most of the salmon farms in the US are gone, and we're really pushing hard to have those in the Canadian coast as well, move it to inland farms so they don't have contact with wild fish. But yeah, it will be very hard to grow native fish in that area. So that's why there's this preference for Pacific salmon in the farms. So nowadays, I think it's like 80 something% is Atlantic salmon, and there's a little bit of Chinook and a little bit of coho, but that's very few. It's mostly Atlantic.
So you say if we give them a chance, can you say what in practical terms does that mean for us? What can we do on an everyday basis to help that translates into positive results for the fish?
That's a good question. I think we have to make smart options and use our resources in a smart way, right? So, for example, uh, what do you use wood? Like, why we log in the forest? So using for construction, you just gotta use those resources in a smart way and recycle as much as we can. So, for example, there's some use for wood that you can just recycle. You don't need to put down another forest, like paper, for example. So we have to be very careful in decisions we make. When you go in the market and you're buying fish, I strongly recommend don't go to the main species like Chinook and sockeye. Maybe try pink salmon, which is a much more environmental friendly way. If you're burning fossil fuel like gas, oil, just be mindful about how much you use. If there is an alternative to go, okay, if I'm heating my house using gas, is there another alternative for it? So I think we have to make those smart alternatives. But again, I understand that we are just a small drop, but if you really show the governments that we're making those decisions because we care, the government, of course, will see like, oh, everyone is concerned about this, then, if I do something good, I may get more votes. So I think it's a lot of like small decisions. Nowadays, we have a lot of eco-friendly, ocean-friendly labels for fish. So definitely recommend when you're buying fish, look what you're getting, see if it's how those fish are catch. I recommend not buying salmon, farmed salmon, which is the most common one we find here, unfortunately, because that's a real big issue. So just make small, smart decisions that will, in the end, impact the ecosystem. But again, we need everyone together, small drops. It makes a difference, but we need big drops in the bucket.
Well, Fernando, unfortunately, that's the last question that we have time for today. So I'd like to hand it back to you for your closing comments.
Yeah, I just hope everyone learns some about salmon. I'm absolutely fascinated about this fish. They're amazing, and they're able to live in such diverse ecosystems. Then I really hope, we can have a future with salmon, and have the chance of going walking in your backyard and see fish and spawning. For me, when I saw it the first time, it was a magical moment, and I really hope the next generations will have the chance. So yeah, I hope everyone enjoyed, and if you have any questions, get in touch, and I love to talk about salmon.
Fernando, thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. Now, if you're interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, please give us a call at the number on your screen, or you could send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including our registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude today's webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.